Los Angeles, 1972. Not the Hollywood version of Los Angeles, not the wide boulevards and palm trees, and the sense that possibility is always just around the next corner. The other version, the one that exists a few miles east of all that, where the buildings are closer together, and the paint peels, and the streets belong to whoever decided they belonged to them, and was willing to back up that decision. Bruce is renting a small apartment on Figueroa, 2 rooms and a kitchen, with a window that overlooks a parking lot. This is before Enter the Dragon, before the money that comes with that, before the fame that changes everything about where a person can live and what the city looks and feels like around them. Right now, Bruce is doing what he has been doing for years, which is working, auditioning, developing his ideas, training every morning at 5, because training is the one thing that doesn't depend on anyone else's decisions. The apartment is not much, but it is enough, and enough has always been sufficient for a man who understands the difference between what he needs and what the world might eventually give him. His mother, Grace, arrived 3 days ago from Hong Kong. She is 62 years old, small and precise in the way that certain women are precise, someone who built a life around attention to the details that actually matter, and developed an efficient relationship with everything else. She had wanted to see how her son was living. She had made no specific comments about the apartment except to immediately identify which shelf in the kitchen needed reorganizing and to reorganize it within the first hour of arriving, which was its own kind of comment. The visit has been good. They have eaten together, talked about the family, talked about the film Bruce is trying to get made, talked about Linda and the children. Grace has opinions about all of it, delivered with the directness of someone who has earned the right to speak plainly, by virtue of having been correct, often enough over a long life. On Thursday morning, Bruce has an audition across town, the kind of meeting that requires him to be somewhere at a specific time, with his full attention directed at the specific thing being asked of him. Grace tells him she'll go to the market while he's gone, a small grocery market 3 blocks from the apartment, on a street she has already walked twice and considers herself familiar with. They will meet afterward at the corner of Figueroa and 27th, the corner with the laundromat, at noon. This is a reasonable plan. The neighborhood is not gentle, but it is navigable in daylight, and Grace is not a woman who has lived 6 decades by being careless about the world around her. Bruce writes down the address of the market in case she needs it, leaves her with money for groceries, tells her noon at the laundromat corner, and goes to his audition. The audition runs long. These things run long, and there is nothing to be done about it when you are not yet in the position to set the terms of how your time gets used. Bruce keeps one eye on the clock, the way you keep one eye on something you're trying not to seem like you're watching, professional and present on the outside, calculating on the inside. The meeting runs until 11:45. He thanks the producer, shakes hands, walks to his car fast without running. The drive back takes 17 minutes on a good day. Today is not a particularly good day for traffic on the 110. Bruce parks at 11 after 12 and walks to the corner of Figueroa and 27th at a pace that is not quite running but has running's intention behind it. His mother is not at the corner. He stands at the laundromat entrance and looks both ways along the block. The corner is busy the way that corner is always busy at midday. People coming and going, a delivery truck blocking the near lane, 2 men talking outside the liquor store across the street. His mother is not part of any of it. He waits 3 minutes. He looks at the watch. He walks half a block toward the market, looking ahead, thinking she is probably just a little late, probably stopped to look at something on the way, probably moving at her own pace, the way she has always moved at her own pace, unhurried and deliberate. He sees her at the far end of the block. She is standing at the mouth of a narrow passage between 2 buildings, the kind of gap that exists in older blocks where the buildings were put up independently without regard for each other, maybe 8 feet wide, used for deliveries and for the kind of transactions that don't require daylight. She has her grocery bag in both arms, pressed against her chest. She is not moving. 2 men are standing very close to her. Bruce covers the distance between himself and his mother in seconds that he does not count, because counting is not what he is doing with his attention right now. He is reading the situation the entire way, reading the posture of the 2 men, reading his mother's stillness, reading the way she is holding the grocery bag, as though it is the thing she is protecting, rather than the most obvious thing to let go of, which tells him something about Grace that he already knew, which is that she does not surrender anything without a specific reason to. One of the men has his hand out toward the bag, the other is standing slightly behind, and to the right of the first, positioned the way the second person in this kind of situation positions themselves, covering the angle, making the space feel smaller than it is, making retreat feel like it requires passing through them. Bruce doesn't announce himself. He doesn't call out. He covers the last 20 feet and arrives between his mother and the man with the extended hand before either man has fully processed that someone has entered the situation. His left hand comes up and redirects the extended arm sideways, not with great force, just enough to move it away from his mother, the way you close a door that's been left open. His right hand finds the man's shoulder and uses his own startled backward lean against him. A small pivot that puts the first man off his balance, and in between Bruce and the second man, without any of the three of them having fully processed that this is happening. "Walk away," Bruce says. He says it once, at normal volume, the way you state a fact you expect to be received without argument. The first man recovers his footing and looks at Bruce. He is maybe 25, thick through the neck, the look of someone who has used physical presence as currency for long enough that being physically present somewhere is itself a kind of argument. He looks at Bruce, who is smaller than him and has appeared from nowhere, and the look he gives is the look of someone recategorizing a situation. "Mind your business," the first man says. "This is my mother," Bruce says. A beat of silence. The second man, the one positioned to cover angles, has shifted slightly, reading Bruce the way people in these situations read new variables, evaluating. "Then tell your mother to hand over the bag," the first man says, "and nobody has a problem." Bruce looks at him with the kind of patience that is not patience at all, but something that looks like patience from the outside, while being something else entirely underneath. He takes one step to the side, positioning himself between the two men and Grace, so that his mother is fully behind him. "I'm going to tell you one more time," Bruce says. "Walk away." The first man decides that the numbers are still in his favor, which by conventional arithmetic they are. He lunges forward, reaching with both hands. What happens in the next several seconds is the specific kind of event that eyewitnesses later describe with consistent frustration, because the consistent experience of watching it was that you could not hold the sequence in order afterward. You had a clear picture of the moment before and a clear picture of the moment after, and the space between them contained a blur of movement that your brain processed as a single impression rather than a series of discrete events. The first man was upright, then he wasn't. The mechanism of the transition was not visible to the three people who could see what was happening, which were Grace, and a man who had just come out of a door 30 feet away and stopped entirely to watch, and a teenage kid on a bicycle who braked without thinking. The second man moved in immediately, abandoning the calculated position he'd been maintaining in favor of forward motion, both arms extended in the way a person moves when they're trying to grab and control rather than strike. Bruce moved inside the grab, not away from it, and the second man's arms closed on a space Bruce was no longer occupying, and the second man's forward momentum had nowhere to apply itself except into the brick wall of the building to his right, which he caught himself against with both palms, his face about 4 inches from the mortar. Bruce stepped back to a neutral position and looked at both men. The first one was on the ground, doing the work of returning himself to upright. The second one was pushing himself off the wall and turning around with an expression that had moved past surprise into something with more heat in it. "Your mother got you running to her rescue?" the second man said. "Yes," Bruce said, which was the only true answer, and also not the answer anyone expected, which disrupted the rhythm of what was supposed to come next, enough that both men paused. The pause lasted about 2 seconds, and then both of them came forward, the calculation having resolved toward continuing rather than leaving, because there were 2 of them, and there was 1 of him, and the math still looked favorable from where they were standing. The next 40 seconds were the 40 seconds that neither of the witnesses could reconstruct cleanly afterward. The teenage kid on the bicycle would say later that he had been watching the whole time and still couldn't say with certainty what Bruce did, except that the 2 men ended up on the ground twice more in different configurations, and Bruce ended up standing where he had been standing before any of it, not breathing hard, not disheveled, looking at the 2 men on the ground with the expression of someone who has completed a small necessary task. Grace, watching from behind Bruce, did not scream during any of this. She held her grocery bag with both arms against her chest and watched the proceedings with the focused attention of a woman evaluating a situation and reserving judgment until she had sufficient information. Bruce turned to look at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Grace said. She looked at the 2 men on the ground, both of them in the process of understanding what had just happened to them. "You're late," she said to Bruce. "The audition ran long," he said. "You should leave earlier to account for that," she said. Then footsteps from further down the passage. More than 2 sets. The kind of footsteps that mean the situation has not yet reached its conclusion, that the conclusion was contingent on something that hadn't yet arrived. 3 more men came around the corner from the far end of the passage, having come through from the street behind. They were clearly connected to the first 2. The recognition was immediate on their faces, and the picture they were arriving into, 2 of their people on the ground and a small man standing over them, produced the specific reaction that picture usually produces in people who have a territorial investment in the block. Bruce assessed the 3 new arrivals. He assessed the 2 men still on the ground. He assessed the width of the passage, which was approximately 8 feet, which meant the 3 men coming from the far end could not arrive all at once, which meant the situation was sequential rather than simultaneous, which was meaningful. He also assessed that his mother was behind him, and the passage was narrow, and the street was at the other end, 30 feet behind, and there was only one useful conclusion to that geometry. "Mom," he said, without turning, "go to the street. Wait at the laundromat corner." "I can see from here," Grace said. "Mom." A pause that communicated a negotiation that had been going on for Bruce Lee's entire life. Then, the sound of Grace's footsteps moving toward the street, unhurried, carrying her grocery bag. The 3 men came forward. The first of them was the largest of the group, the kind of large that comes from a specific application of physical confidence over a long time, and he moved with the economy of someone who didn't expect to need much effort. He led with a wide right hand, a big committed swing, with real intention behind it. Bruce didn't block it. He stepped inside it, getting closer rather than further, inside the arc of the swing, where the force hadn't developed fully yet, and redirected the arm past his own shoulder, with a touch that used the arm's own momentum, rather than opposing it. The man stumbled slightly from the sudden absence of what his swing was expecting to hit, and his left side opened. Bruce's right hand found the man's floating rib, a short, precise strike that made the man fold slightly and lose the thread of what he was doing. The second man came from the left with a lower tackle attempt, trying to use the lesson of the first exchange and get underneath the striking. Bruce dropped his level and intercepted the grab at the shoulders with both forearms, using the man's forward momentum and a small directional addition to send him into the wall on Bruce's right. Shoulder first, hard enough to stop him, but not hard enough to do anything permanent. The third man stopped. He had watched the first 2 resolve in a span of time, shorter than he had expected, and from a position close enough to see the mechanics of it clearly enough to understand that the mechanics were operating by different rules than he was prepared for. Bruce looked at him. He was breathing harder now, genuinely, the accumulated physical work of the last few minutes beginning to register in his body the way work registers whether you want it to or not. "You done?" the third man said, more a genuine question than a challenge, the kind of question you ask when you're trying to understand a situation before deciding what to do next. "If you are," Bruce said. The man who had taken the rib strike was leaning against the wall with one arm, the other pressed to his side, not incapacitated, but not at full capacity either. The man who had hit the wall shoulder first was on his feet, but had that shoulder drawn in slightly, testing it. The original 2, who had started all of this, were both upright now, standing further back in the passage, and the expression on both of them had moved from whatever it was when this started into something quieter and more internal. The third man looked at the situation. He looked at Bruce. He made the decision that the evidence in front of him recommended. "We're done," he said. He went to the man with the shoulder and helped him move toward the far end of the passage. The man with the rib injury followed. The original 2 followed after that, and Bruce stood in the passage and watched all 5 of them disappear around the corner at the far end. Then he stood there for a moment in the empty passage, the sound of the street on both ends, the sound of his own breathing which was elevated in a way that would return to normal in 2 or 3 minutes, the smell of the alley, which was not pleasant. He checked his hands. No damage. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the street. Grace was at the laundromat corner, grocery bag still held with both arms. She looked at him when he arrived. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, the way a mother looks at a son she has watched grow up, and still finds slightly surprising in specific moments. The expression not quite pride, and not quite something else, and probably both. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," Bruce said. She looked at him for another moment, then looked back toward the passage. "There were 5 of them," she said. "Yes," Bruce said. "By the end. Yes." She considered this with the careful consideration she gave most things. "You need to move out of this neighborhood," she said. Bruce almost smiled. "Working on it," he said. "Work faster," she said. They walked back to the apartment together. Grace told him what she bought at the market, itemized, with the specific prices of each item and her assessment of whether each price was acceptable or not. Bruce listened. The neighborhood moved around them, the same neighborhood it had been an hour ago, indifferent to the passage behind the market and everything that had happened in it. At the apartment door, Grace stopped. She adjusted the grocery bag to one arm and used her free hand to straighten Bruce's collar, which had been slightly displaced during the activities of the last 30 minutes. She straightened it with the precise attention of someone correcting a small error in an otherwise acceptable presentation. "You were late," she said again. "I know," Bruce said. "You should have called," she said. There wasn't a phone at the audition, he said. She looked at him with the expression that had ended arguments in the Lee household since before Bruce could remember, the expression that acknowledged what had been said and communicated simultaneously that its adequacy as a reason was still under review. Then she went inside and began unpacking the groceries. Bruce stood in the doorway for a moment before following her in. He looked down the street, the way you sometimes look at a place after something has happened in it, checking whether the place has registered what occurred the way it should, finding that it hasn't, that it looks exactly the same, which is simultaneously the expected result and slightly startling every time. He thought about the 5 men. He thought about the first 2, what brought them to that passage, what they expected from a 62-year-old woman with a grocery bag, what they expected from him when he arrived. He thought about the 3rd man, who had stopped and asked a genuine question and received a genuine answer and made a reasonable decision based on the evidence in front of him. He thought there was something in that 3rd man that was worth noticing. The willingness to actually look at what was there, rather than at what the situation was supposed to contain. He went inside and helped his mother put away the groceries, which she allowed him to do for approximately 90 seconds before redirecting him to a more specific task, which was getting the shelf above the sink organized in a way she had identified as necessary since her first day in the apartment. They had lunch. They talked. The afternoon moved through the apartment the way afternoons move through small spaces, the light shifting across the floor, the sounds of the neighborhood outside the window. Grace told Bruce 3 things about the behavior of his children that she thought required his attention, in order of priority. Bruce listened to all 3 and agreed to address them, which Grace received with the mild skepticism of someone who has heard this agreement before. Later that afternoon, Bruce's friend and student Dan Inosanto stopped by. They had a training session planned in the courtyard of the building, the kind of session that happens in the spaces available when you don't have a gym. Grace sat in the window and watched for a while, then went back to the book she had brought from Hong Kong, a Chinese novel she had been reading for several weeks, moving through it at the same pace she moved through everything, steady and without urgency. Dan asked Bruce afterward, quietly, how his mother's visit was going. Bruce said good. Dan asked if anything interesting had happened. Bruce thought about the passage, the 5 men, the grocery bag. She told me I need to move to a better neighborhood, he said. Dan looked at the apartment, the peeling paint, the parking lot out the window. She's not wrong, Dan said. She's rarely wrong, Bruce said. They left it there. The man who stopped, the 3rd one, thought about the encounter for longer than he expected to. He thought about it on the bus home that afternoon, and he thought about it the next morning when he woke up, and the first thing his brain offered him was the image of a small man standing in a passage with 5 people on one side and nobody on the other, not breathing hard, not moving from where he was standing, asking if they were done in a tone that had no particular emotion attached to it. He had seen people fight before. He had been in situations that required him to be present while violence was conducted. He had a working model of how physical confrontations went and who won them and why. What he saw in that passage didn't fit the model. Not because of the outcome. Outcomes surprised you sometimes and you adjusted. Because of the quality of the man in the middle of it. The complete absence of anything that looked like urgency. The sense, watching him, that the situation was being processed in a different way from how the situation was being experienced by everyone else in it. Like he was watching something from slightly outside it, at the same time he was inside it. The 3rd man had been in situations that required quick decisions, and he had learned to trust the part of himself that processed information faster than he could articulate what it was processing. That part of him had told him, watching the 5 seconds and the 40 seconds after, that continuing was inadvisable in a way that was qualitatively different from the usual advisability calculus of fighting or not fighting. It wasn't about the odds. It was about something he couldn't name. He didn't go back to that block for 2 weeks, which was unusual for him. When he went back, he walked past the passage and didn't look down it, which was less unusual, but still deliberate. He found out the name a month later, heard it from someone who had been at the other end of the block that day, and looked the thing up afterward. He received the name and held it in his mind for a while. He thought about the old woman with the grocery bag who had stood perfectly still while 2 men tried to take it from her and hadn't screamed and hadn't begged and hadn't done anything except hold the bag against her chest and wait, with the specific patience of someone who trusts that the situation will resolve. He thought about the son who had arrived late and run down the block and stepped into the situation without announcing himself, and stood between his mother and 5 men, and when it was over, turned to check whether she was all right before doing anything else. He kept that detail. The turning first, the first question being about her. He kept it the way you keep things that tell you something about how people can be. that you encounter unexpectedly, and that stay with you as a kind of evidence for something you don't have full language for yet. Evidence that certain things are possible, that the gap between how most people move through the world and how it might be possible to move through it is real and crossable, though the crossing takes most of a lifetime, and even then, you probably don't arrive. He never told this story to anyone except once, years later, to a younger man who was asking him about the decisions he had made in his 20s, what he wished he had done differently, what he was glad he'd done. The younger man was expecting advice about choices, about directions, about the conventional wisdom of regret and correction. Instead, he told the story about a passage behind a market on Figueroa Street and a man he didn't know who stepped between his mother and 5 people and stood there and turned to check on her first when it was over. He said he had spent a long time thinking about that turn. The first question being about her, not about himself, not about the 5 of them, not about what had just happened or how it had happened, just about whether she was all right. He said that the turn was the part that stuck, not the fighting, which was extraordinary, and he understood that. The turn was ordinary. Any sun would turn. But the quality of it, the immediate completeness of the focus it represented, the way everything else had simply closed off the moment it was done, and his attention had moved to the thing that mattered, that was not ordinary. He said he had been trying to learn how to do that for years, ever since that afternoon. To be done with one thing completely before moving to the next. To give the thing that matters the full attention that it deserves, rather than the attention that's left over after everything else has taken its share. He said he wasn't there yet, but he was trying. The younger man asked him if he ever found out who the man was. He said yes, eventually. The younger man asked what he thought when he found out. He thought about it for a moment before answering. He said he thought, that explains some of it, the speed, the technique, the specific quality of the movement in those 40 seconds. That's explainable by training, by discipline, by what a person can become through sustained and serious work over many years. But he said the turn was still the part he thought about, because the turn didn't come from training, the turn came from somewhere else. From something prior to any technique, prior to any discipline, the thing that was there before the training, that the training had refined but not produced. He said he thought the word for it might be love, though that wasn't quite right either. It was the thing that, when something is over, sends your attention without any deliberate instruction to the person who matters most to you, and makes the first question be about them. He said he had been trying to have that, or to become more of a person who has it, ever since a Wednesday afternoon in Los Angeles, on a block he still drove past sometimes when he was in that part of the city. The grocery bag, he said, was still in her arms when her son arrived. She had held on to it through all of it. He thought that was worth noting. He was right, it was.